accordingly. So Dudu is an independent researcher, and she completed her PhD in 2017 at the University of Witwatersrand, and she wrote on Zimbabwean migrant memorials of violence. Her research interests are in using arts-based research methods to decolonize knowledge production. And in her work, she has stumbled onto poetry and how she uses poetry in translating her thesis into poems to access a wider audience is the focus of her work. And she has edited an open access text titled Moving Words, Poetry in and As Method, which is the book that she was doing her PhD. And this is what motivates her and gives her courage to use poetry. Aniel Franco is from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. She was born and raised in Favela da Murray. She has a bachelor's degree in journalism and English from North Carolina Central University. And she's currently a doctoral student at Federal University and she works on applied linguistics. Aniel has published her first book called Letter to Marielle and has also been an editor of a Brazilian edition of Angela Davis's autobiography. She works as a speaker and a writer and is currently an executive director of the Marielle Franco Institute. She has been at the forefront of the fight for justice for her sister, Marielle Franco, a human rights activist from Brazil. And Aniel uses her voice to inspire other women, girls, and marginalized communities in Brazil and the world to keep changing societal structures. Aniel believes in the power of storytelling, memories, and culture to honor the legacy of those who came before and who constructed ideas of justice. And finally, we have Ece Temelkoran, who's an award-winning Turkish novelist, a political thinker, and a public speaker whose work has appeared in The Guardian, New York Times, Le Monde, New Statesman, and various other very prestigious publications. She has won the Edinburgh International Book Festival First Book Award for her novel Women Who Blow on Knots, and the Ambassador of New Europe Award for her book Turkey, The Insane and the Melancholy. She's the author of the internationally acclaimed book How to Lose a Country Together, a Manifesto Against the Heartless World. Her latest book has been published in several languages and has recently been shortlisted for the Torzani Award in Italy. Ece has lived in Beirut, Tunis, Paris to write her novels, and she was a visiting fellow at St. Antony's College, Oxford, where she was working on the book titled Deep Mountain Across the Armenian-Turkish Divide. So I will now we will get started with the program. If I could quickly lay out, sorry, I think there is a problem with Meena just messaged saying that she is not able to figure out the link. So maybe we should just send her Ismail around. Is it possible to share the link with her? Yes.
I'll sort out now.
You have her email, right? Yeah, if you could just email her the appropriate link. Yeah. So, so just to lay out the format for the benefit of our speakers and of the audience today. So we will have a first round where we will talk about, we will get to know from our speakers, what is it that drove them to, inspired them to get involved with this work and how their work relates to democracy. So we have the first 3 minutes from each speaker where we ask them this question about broadly what we would like our speakers to reflect on is what is their work and how does their work relate to democracy and how do they come to be associated with this work. So while Meena is joining in, if I could start off with Dudu maybe. So if I could ask you, if you could give us some examples from your work on migration and citizenship and how you came about to be associated with this work. So over to Dudu now.
Thank you, and thank you for having me here.
I want to start my answer with a poem that I think answers the question that you're asking me. And the poem is called Illegal Immigrant. Sweet words I keep under my tongue, so when you stop me, I negotiate the bribe price of my freedom. Call me any name, I am here to stay. I will find a job, any that affords me to stay. I pay daily for my stay, yet they still call me an illegal immigrant. So my work is in migration studies, and I think when we're talking about democracy, migrants or refugees, forced people that are forced to move, displaced people, I think they typify people that get to be outside of the system of democracy, whether they are documented in whatever country that they find themselves in. They are outside citizenship rights, even though they may be contributing. I mean, they are contributing to the place in which they reside, and yet they are typically illegal migrants, if I can put it that way. But also beyond mobile people within the African continent, we have borders that are arbitrary, borders that came with colonialism, borders that left groups of people that would have maybe separated themselves. So when we think about borders, I think all borders are artificial, right? All borders are created to separate us and them. But when we look at post-colonial borders, they are really arbitrary, and there are many groups that might find themselves within nations that are supposed to have citizenship rights, but that still find themselves marginalized. So I think briefly that would be my answer in terms of how my work in migration studies links to citizenship. But also, I think a lot of the times as academics, we live out our own personal narrative. I myself am a migrant, and in as much as I am studying migrants, a lot of the narrative that I am studying in my academic work is also my own personal narrative. Thank you.
Thank you, Dudu. That's really, really helpful. And we are very glad that our other panelist is also here. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Meena Kandaswamy, who is a very celebrated poet and an anti-caste activist, novelist, and translator. And her writing aims to deconstruct trauma and violence while spotlighting the militant resistance against caste, gender, and ethnic oppressions. And she has won numerous awards, and most recently the Herman Keston Award, which recognizes her work on caste, gender, and ethnic oppression. So welcome, Meena. And if I could quickly move to you and ask you to reflect on how your, in about 3 minutes, how your poetry and fiction engages questions of trauma and violence as also anti-caste resistance, and how did you come to research and write on this topic?
Thank you, Sagni, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for having me here. So the thing is, I'm really sorry for the delay as well. My babysitter came in late, so it's nothing personal. It's not like I don't take academic meetings seriously, just a difficult situation. So the thing is, I finished school, and my personal experience comes from the fact that, both my parents were university professors. My father was a first generation learner, and so they faced a lot of hostility as, people of oppressed caste or very marginalized backgrounds. My father comes from a nomadic tribe. My mom comes from a lower caste, in order to make their inroad into academia, which is, in the Indian context, very Brahmanical, it's really like education is seen as something to do with the most upper layer of society, the caste system. So I kind of saw them fighting all of these battles inside for social justice, for reservation. And I somehow, as a younger person, internalized that this has to be the struggle much more than getting educated, getting jobs, getting stuff. So when I finished school, I was like, I'm going to work on this issue, because I felt that it's not only a struggle to be taking place within the university system, because caste was everywhere. You know, and also I was growing up in the late 90s, and I remember reading in the papers, like, one day you wake up and then you see, I think the one incident that, I think a couple of incidents captured me and just completely turned me. And, I was a science student at school. My parents expected I'd become a scientist or an engineer. But in 1997, for instance, there was the murder of Melavala Murugesan. So at this time, a Dalit was the nominal president of India, which is like a nominal post as opposed to a very powerful post. But this guy was in a small village, and he had just stood in the elections to become the village headman, and he won this, and he was the village headman. But people were like, how can a Dalit be the leader of our village? A Dalit can be the leader of this country. We don't care. But as long as this village is in our control. So they beheaded him, and they beheaded 7 of his associates. And the way it happened was crazy. He had just gone to appeal to the police asking for protection. And when he was taking the bus back, his killers got on the same bus. They stopped the bus at some, deserted place, like basically slaughtered them. So we were growing up actually reading this kind of thing. I also think that it was in the late 90s, we had Lakshmanpur Bate, like, and Batanitola, where like about 50, 60 Dalits were massacred in a single event by feudal landlords, because they were fighting for land rights, so, fighting against oppression, or, just identifying themselves as communists. So I was really, growing up and reading this, I was really very, very, very drawn. So that's where my work and my own engagement comes in. But this also ties up to what Sagnik had earlier written to us and asked, which is how does anti-caste politics tie up with democracy? We can come to that later. But all of this was actually the struggle for people to, hold offices of power, to speak their rights. And so this is where my writing comes from. So do I have a minute, or because I'm not keeping time, Sagnik, you have to tell me?
Yeah, I am keeping time. Yeah, you can take 1 more minute. Yeah, sure.
Just 1 more minute, yeah. So for instance, thank you. So for instance, one of those things that happens in my first novel is the story of so on Christmas Day 1968, 44 Dalit formerly untouchable landless agricultural laborers are burnt to death because they were striking for higher wages. And this happens in my home state of Tamil Nadu, in Tanjore, which is where all the rice cultivation takes place, or majority of the rice cultivation takes place. And this is very interesting because everybody who died happens to be Dalits. Majority of them happen to be women and children. But somehow this became a folktale about communism. But most of us didn't even read this in school. And nobody spoke about the fact that, the most militant communists, the communists who were willing to die for this kind of, fighting feudalism, fighting caste, were actually Dalit people, because there's this idea that somehow, all of the theories is a very high caste practice. So for me, I went there and I spent like, I wrote this novel over a period of 6 years to just to foreground the militancy of these Dalit people, to say that it might have been a communist struggle, but look at where it was coming from. You just cannot write away people because they may not, be high-falutin theorists, and also to show, and this was like the aim I went there was to retrieve the role of the Dalit people in the struggle, or the most oppressed people. But on the ground, I realized that so much of it was also actually led by the women. Like when we talk about workers, when we talk about agriculture, when we talk about laborers, like it's so much easier to just assume that it's men doing all of this because our perceptions in general are, so gendered. But then women were actually the most militant in terms of fighting all of this oppression. So I wrote my first novel about it, and it's called The Gypsy Goddess. So that's my work comes in, but also that's where the trauma comes in, and, the violence comes in, I guess.
Thank you, Meena. And I think thank you for bringing up the gender dimension of this, and also the question of how theorizing is presumed to be the kind of forte of upper castes in the academia as well. So I think that will open up a lot of threads for conversations that we'll have in the course of the session. So next on, if I could kind of ask Aniel maybe that you have, Ania, you have been involved with anti-racist movements in Brazil. If you could tell us a bit about your story and how you also bring together the worlds of journalism and academia, how you became involved with these movements. Yes, Ania.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure being here. I'm Aniele Franco. I'm Marielle Franco's sister. Marielle was murdered on March 2018. She used to be a councilwoman here, and she was only 1 year and 3 months in politics, and she was killed with 5 shots on her head. But before that, I used to live in the US playing volleyball and study. And when I come back to Brazil after 12 years of being there, my sister entered politics, of being a very leader and activist in Brazil. And since they killed her, I've become this, I would say, leader for the Black women's movement in Brazil, and not only in academia as journalist, but also as Marielle Franco's sister. So since 2018, we have created an institute with her name. So it's Marielle Franco Institute, and we've been doing many things, not only in education, but also trying to show how political violence has increased so much in Brazil since 2010. Her murder was the beginning of a lot of, not only like a period, but also our government that entered in 2018 and has been spreading a lot of fake news and hateness towards not only Black women, but Black people in general. So my work goes combined with all of this. I'm trying to summarize everything because I know now I only have 3 minutes, but basically this is it. And today I'm a doctorate student in a federal university here in Brazil. And we've been connecting with many other activists, also speaking about fake news, because our last president was elected based on fake news, specifically towards Black people, poor people, LGBTQI+ people, immigrants, and all that. So this is a little bit of my work, and we can talk later, a little bit more later.
Thank you, Ania. That was so fascinating to hear. And now if I could ask Ajay, that how did you come to write about the topics that you write on, migration, travel, and the decline of democracy? If you could tell us a bit about the story as to how you came about to write on these topics. Ajay?
Thank you, Sagnik, and it is wonderful to be with these, beautiful, brave, incredibly bright women today. Thank you for inviting me. I think, while listening to everybody, I thought when it comes to women, politics is personal even more than it is for men. We are living the struggle on several levels. And let me just start by saying that I salute Iranian women today who are in the front line, fighting in the front line of the female resistance that is rising in the world today. I do think that there is a global war on women, and there is no country for women at this point. Not that because we are from India, Turkey, South Africa, Brazil, where the oppression is more visible than it is in the United States or in Europe, but it is because it is becoming, the oppression and the war is becoming more and more present all over the world. And my work, not unlike my friends here on this panel, is pretty much related to my personal life as well. Well, I am an immigrant, refugee, exile, whatever you call it. As Dudu said earlier, call me any name, I'm here to stay, in her beautiful poetry. I am an immigrant at the moment, but I started writing about immigration and all the other very cheerful topics when I was very, very young. I was 19 when I started journalism. I was 20-something, 23 when I first published my book. And my work always centered around women, the oppressed, those people who are not given a voice, and so on. I did journalism for 20 years, but then, as you very well know, due to the political situation in Turkey, I couldn't do my job anymore, and since then I'm only writing books. And right now I'm in Hamburg as a visiting fellow at the NEU Institute. I'm working on the program called Future of Democracy. In 2016, I had to leave the country like many others. But the funny part of this story is that I am called an exile because I'm writing, I'm talking, and that gives me the title of nobility, so to speak. I am not counted as a refugee. Even funnier part of the story is that I am constantly asked about my personal story, whereas no refugee is asked enough about their story. When you're called an exile, you kind of play this role of intellectual damsel in distress, running away from the barbarians, throwing herself into the arms of civilized world. And I think Western civilization, Western audiences still find it quite intriguing and exotic to see a woman who is, writing and who is coming from this other part of the world, which is considered to be uncivilized. So that is why I am avoiding, as far as I can, to tell my own story, whereas I try to tell other people's stories. And the part of this stance, so to speak, was to start writing in English. And How to Lose a Country, my previous book, was not about my country or me, but rather about the Western countries whose democracy has been in danger for a while. So I didn't want to tell my story, but instead I wanted to tell their story to them, which is not easy when you have curly hair and coming from Turkey. People tend not to believe in you when you start saying that my country is not crazy and your country is as crazy anyway. Since 2016, I'm trying to explain through writing and talking that the demise of democracy is a global phenomenon, and it is not a problem that we can fix by mending the democratic mechanism here and there, because it is the crisis is embedded in neoliberalism. And the crisis arises mainly from the fact that there is extreme inequality, both between the social classes and also between the global north and global south. Therefore, I'm mostly talking about rise of fascism. And rise of fascism is always coupled with, throughout human history, coupled with misogyny and patriarchy. So I am also focusing on how women are becoming the canaries in the mine just before the collapse. I lately wrote another book called Together, a manifesto against the heartless world. And that was to propose a way out of this political and moral madness, so to speak. And I do think that the progressives of the world, especially women, need a new vocabulary to raise their demands and to share same words so they can gather around these concepts to make the resistance more global, which I think should be at this point. And as I said, I am, a fellow at the Future of Democracy program. So I am also thinking about what democracy should look like. Now, I'm not only interested in the crisis, but also in the, a better democracy, how we can build it. Is it possible to change everything entirely, so we can actually exercise democracy as it is supposed to be exercised. And in order to do that, I think one cannot dismiss the fact that capitalism has to be questioned deeply and thoroughly. This is still not a very mainstream idea. Both in the United States and Europe, people tend to reject this idea that there is something wrong with capitalism as well. But I think if there are enough people around this idea, supporting this idea, it will very quickly become, more tolerable and more mainstream. And it should be so, because there is no way out of this democratic crisis unless we dive deep into the crisis of neoliberalism, both in economic terms and in moral terms. So yeah, and I'm so happy to be here with these amazing women, because I do think that, as Mina told earlier, it is the women that will lead the way to a global change, not because I'm an optimist, but because I know the history of humankind. All revolutions, as far as I know, without any exception, has been led by women, including French Revolution, Russian Revolution, whatever revolution you can think of, because they are the ones who suffer more, and they become very quickly those who have nothing to lose. So there is a reason why women are more brave, because they have no other choice. Thank you again for including me in this wonderful panel.
Thank you, Ajay. Those were really perceptive comments, and especially I think your comment about how you are thinking about new visions of democracy provides us a nice way to the next set of comments and reflections that we are inviting our panelists to make. And in the next round, we would really invite the panelists to make some general reflections or comments on how what might be the role of creative arts and the power of the written word, poetry, music, and writing in this whole process of reinventing citizenship and renewing democracy. And if I could start with Mina, I would request you to maybe talk about what hope you see for the renewal of democracy in India, and what new forms of anti-caste politics, what kind of a role might they play in that process, and has the decline of democracy, has it impacted anti-caste mobilizations? So yes, over to Mina. And we have about 10 minutes for each panelist in this round. Yes, Mina. Mina, are you there with us? Yeah, please.
So here again, it's really very interesting, because I have to make like 4 broad points. I just try to keep time as well. So the first thing is that I'm so happy that Asa made this point about fascism, and linked it directly with neoliberalism and capitalism. And I think it's something that, I really also want to chew on, because very few people are calling it out. Because what we have here is we have a culture of liberals who, don't want to do the smallest critique of capitalism, but, just it's very nice to say, oh, this religion is bad, Islamists are bad, Hindutva is bad. And you just talk about this, and, you're just basically scratching the surface instead of, going to the root of the problem. And you can understand as well, because, if you are not a neoliberal, you cannot do intellectual activity in these times, because you need to somehow be part of the machinery in order to, sustain yourself, raise funds, whatever it is that it takes. So, I think I kind of, like really completely wanted to go there, because nobody is going there and talking about what it means to build this broader support for, the system change, the end of capitalism. Because unless you envision that, we just cannot cry about fascism or sign petitions or, do, demos. So, and the reason I make this point is because, there's another tendency, which is within India, the tendency to look at all politics as Delhi based. just as in the world, we have a tendency of looking at all politics as, around New York or London or these big centers of power, and we don't look at what's happening in, like just off the map places. So in Tamil Nadu, for instance, and I think I previously had the chance to speak with Indrajit about it many, many months ago, which is the way the character of the anti-caste movement has built itself. So the anti-caste movement, instead of, being oppressed, of course it's oppressed on an everyday basis, but instead of just getting into this victimhood narrative, has been at the forefront of challenging fascism. And so it's not technically, you don't have to say, oh, we are fighting only caste. They're not saying, oh, we're just happy as long as all of us are equal. On the other hand, they're saying we are going to lead the charge against fascists. Like, it's not anybody's business, and we are going to lead the charge against the capitalists who are holding up the system. And this is really this came about, and I just want to take I've taken 2 minutes, I have 8 minutes more. So what happened is that on the 2nd of October, which was the birthday of Gandhi, the Hindutva fascists, or the RSS, which is the Sangh Parivar, whatever names they call themselves by, wanted to hold a march in 50 different cities of Tamil Nadu, saying that it was like their route march, but they were commemorating Gandhi. Now this is very crazy, because it was somebody with RSS affinities who assassinated Gandhi. And what does that have? Why do they have to reclaim Gandhi's birthday? The second was, what type of communal disharmony were they trying to spread by, going on this kind of marches? So when this kind of thing happened, the anti-caste movement, which in Tamil Nadu is, the Ambedkarite movement, which is the Dalit Panthers, or what they call the Liberation Panthers. In Tamil, it's Vidudalai Chirutaigal Katchi, the VCK. It said, we are also taking to the streets. So it was not just about giving some statements or trying to go to so they went to the court, said the RSS should not be allowed, the fascists should not be allowed in the streets. But then politically they said, we are taking to the streets. And what happened was the communists joined in, and then the other progressives joined in, and everybody, literally every single progressive organization and political party said, we are also going to be part of this anti-fascist human chain that we're going to organize. And this is again so important, because when we say we are fighting fascism, you do it, of course, at the level of ideas. Of course, you do it on Twitter, you do wherever the fascists are. But when push comes to shove, you have to meet fascists on the streets. Like there's nothing else that can replace that. And this is where again it follows to talk about the end of capitalism also as an end of individualism, because if people are not trained to do collective stuff, if they don't have the understanding of how do you fight them, how do you get together, how do you mobilize yourself on the street, how do you put people's interest ahead of self-interest, then you cannot overnight do this. And then we really saw in front of our eyes like this collapse, like the fascist rally in the end just did not take place, because the police knew that this would lead to stuff, so they refused to give permission. So there were a lot of setbacks. It's still an evolving situation, but I really wanted to say this because when we look at anti-caste movements, there's a tendency to only concentrate on them as people who are asking for bigger rights, like the right of social justice, the right of non-discrimination. We think that they're making all of these really small progressive things, like okay, they're trying to secure maybe cement houses for Dalit people, or they're trying to secure the right to work. So it's looked at as a lot of civil rights issues, but they're not just people fighting for these small civil rights issues. They're people who are taking on fascism. And going back to the previous speaker, I think what really amazed me was and also it's something that absolutely makes you emotional when you write or look at this, is people who have nothing to lose, who are actually leading the charge. So so that's something I wanted to come in, because we wanted to speak on anti-caste movements, but there's also something else that is happening so this is the Tamil Nadu case, but I also don't want to be just a regionalist and just speak about my own state. Is that, of course, this is an exceptional state also because of its previous history in terms of, challenging the imposition of Hindutva. So it's not easy to lock up a lot of people, but in the rest of the country, they have succeeded. And and here I want to talk about the Bhima Koregaon conspiracy case, where 16 of the most active anti-capitalist, pro-Dalit, anti-caste, anti-mining, anti-corporate, activists have been thrown in jail for the last 4 years. They're still awaiting trial. So there has been, charge sheets filed of about 10,000 or whatever pages. There has been proof from at least 2 different firms which show that all the evidence against them was planted on their laptops by the police forces itself. So they were arrested, and then the laptops were seized, and then the controversial information was seized, but later on forensic, by independent investigation bodies abroad showed that, this had been planted in their devices. They had all been completely snooped upon through Pegasus software. And going more than this, one of the things that, and this is where, so one of the things is also that, every time there's an effort to silence these voices, I think the knee-jerk, and we cannot also divorce this from, both the fight against capitalism, the fight against fascism, and the fight against imperialism, because what imperialism has done to the world order is also invent this concept of the war on terror. And this war on terror is used so strategically, so extremely well, that anybody who raises the smallest amount of dissent is called a terrorist. So what has happened again is, in the context of, there are two things I would like to say here. Is in the context of these anti-caste, because they were not only anti-caste people, if you look at these 16 people and look at their profile, some of them are anti-caste activists, until today, for instance. Some of them were cultural organizations at the grassroots level. Some of them were anti-mining and anti-corporate, like Sudha Bharadwaj and Mahesh Raut. Some of them were against, corporate land grabs. And some of them were obviously anti-Hindutva as well. So it's this really wonderful mix of people who have been called terrorists, and they're charged under the UAPA, which is the Terrorist Act. And what the UAPA does is that it refuses bail to you. So you have, they know that they cannot convict these people because no judicial system can put them in jail. So the only way they keep them in prison is keep them as under trials. So I think this is also the democratic clampdown that, anti-caste movements face. For instance, there's been a systematic targeting of Dalit leaders, a targeting of Dalit voices, but also I think, it's very important to talk about what's happening to Muslim organizations today, and the manner in which overnight, for instance, see, an organization could be communal. I'm not saying it's not. But overnight, there was a midnight raids on the PFI, people being picked up at 3 or 4 in the morning, all of the leaders of this organization being taken to Delhi and held in detention. And then about 4 or 5 state agencies started probing them for, Islamic terror. And so overnight, this entire organization was, banned. But, you speak to activists and you realize, and not many people can, and because they were banned, then all members who have affiliations become members of a banned terrorist organization overnight. And the ban came at I think the circular was uploaded and it came at 5:43 a.m. So this is not how democracy functions. And I think the ban had much more to do, not because the nature of the organization itself, but it connects to, I think I'm on my last minute, it connects to 3 different protests. The first was the citizenship protests of 2020, when Muslims in India were protesting, including in Shaheen Bagh, by occupying streets, by occupying many important places, saying that, this new citizenship laws, which are going to make us, deprive us of voting rights, deprive us of citizenship, equal citizenship, should not come into place. So this was a way of criminalizing the community and also couldn't participate politically. And the second thing was, what happened in Hathras. So in Hathras, a Dalit girl was raped, murdered, and then the police actually burnt her body. There was no justice. And a journalist sets out from, another state to cover this, and he is arrested as a terrorist. And then everybody involved with the organization or the newspaper for which he's writing, they're all called terrorists, and it becomes the Hathras conspiracy case. And the third is, of course, the women in the south of India fighting for the right to wear the hijab in the state of Karnataka, because any student who wears an hijab is not allowed into the classroom. So girls are fighting for the rights. And it was often suspected or said that the PFI was behind these women. So again, what is happening is this pattern of, people being victimized. So whether it's the Bhima Koregaon case, or whether it's the Hathras case, or the citizenship case, or the hijab, or women choose asking for the hijab, the rights to wear the hijab. So there is a section of people who are the real victims. And then the state comes in, of course, a Hindutva fascist state comes in, and it throws the same people who are asking for these rights, the same people who have become victims, into jail, saying that was a conspiracy of violence. So it's really, I think it's really something that needs unpacking, but also needs much more global light on what is happening in India.
Thank you, Meena. That was a lot of information for us to think about, and I think that it really gives us a lot of food for thought. So if I could now ask Dudu, what do you think, how do you think arts-based activism can create and deepen a public consciousness of democracy? Yes, over to Dudu. And you have also about 10 minutes.
Thank you. So I come to this as a researcher, and I'm going to share a story that what happened in my PhD work. So I was trained as a researcher to base my questions on literature, so that I am in conversation with other with literature that's been written. And so I had this question for migrants about their memorialization practices. And this was for my MA research. And when I finished my MA research, I got a call from one of the participants, and he said, "We've just recorded a CD, and will you support us by buying a copy?" And when I got the music, I actually realized that I didn't have to do all the field work that I had done interviewing people, because they had already documented and written their narratives in this music. And so I'm saying this as an answer to the fact, I think the people are deeply aware of their condition and are producing and documenting what is happening. But as an academic, I was looking for data that was packaged in a certain way. Copland in 1988 has an article about Lesotho migrants and their sung poetry that basically documents the transition in their communities because of colonialism. Now they have to migrate in order to afford the taxes that they have to pay. And so I think there's so much knowledge that we, at least as academics, sometimes we are blind to, because we are expecting resistance to be packaged in a particular way. We're expecting people to speak about the government or what is happening in a particular way. But actually, the arts allow for ambiguity. They allow for safety, especially in spaces where it's actually difficult to speak about some of these things. For example, in Zimbabwe, there's an artist that had an exhibition about a period of violence, and now is living in exile, as Ege was speaking about herself. And so it's not always possible that people can narrate and speak out about how they observe issues of governance, and especially in spaces where the government has been violent, in spaces where the government is repressive. And so I want to play a song. For me, this song gives me hope, because I think a lot of the times when I think about the political context that I come from, for example, in Zimbabwe, and which is the government is very violent, and has and I live in Johannesburg, so I'm able to speak about the Zimbabwean government, but in a very different way to when I am back home. I mean, even inside, speaking to someone inside my mother's house people will lower their voices, people will look at, like, there's that kind of vigilance and mistrust of anyone, because anybody can be someone who can spy on you to government officials. And so I think thinking about democracy and violence in the context of some of these countries where governments are repressive, governments are violent, the arts also bring hope in that you can speak about these issues. So the song that I want to play a short clip of this song. What is the song is saying? It's by a South African musician, and he is basically saying all the leaders are the same. They are all unjust. They are all after their own pockets. But one day the masses will arise and they'll come together and they will take back the power. So I'll just conclude with that.
Ziafana zonke, zikamakoki so. Ziafana zonke, zikamamenemene, zikamakoki so. Ziafana zonke, zikamapete, zikamakoki so. Ziafana zonke, zikamakoki so. Eyikotwa ngenye iminibo, abantu bamanyane bathathe amandla kubo, bovuka abantu bamanyane bathathe amandla kubo, bovuka abantu bamanyane bathathe amandla kubo, bovuka abantu bamanyane bathathe amandla. Siyafana sonke, zikamakoki so. Siyafana sonke, zikamapete, siyafana sonke.
So I think the arts provide space to speak in spaces where it may be unsafe to speak, but at the same time, it also provides a space for resistance that allows for identities that are beyond the ones that are within the structures that are available.
Yeah, are you done? Yeah. Thank you. That was so fascinating, and the music I'm sure we all enjoyed listening to the music clip very much. And thank you for your very perceptive comments, also about the ambiguity of art and what kinds of options it makes available for protest. Now, if I could ask Aniel maybe to talk about the situation in Brazil, that Brazil currently exemplifies struggles over democracy. And in that context, what kind of mobilizations do you think might contribute to a renewal of democracy? So over to Aniel.
Yes, I would like to start saying that in Brazil, we are having the past 4 years, one of the hardest times for Black people and for Black women in general. We are the country who are killing every 23 minutes a Black person, especially if those people are in the favelas, in the slums. And we saw and faced the past 2 years since 2020, different type of deaths where people are getting killed in supermarkets or in the streets or just going back to work. And since then, we've been fighting against this, saying also because my sister, when they killed her, she became the symbol for resignification, for resistance, for democracy. And the government still has not answered who ordered to kill her, and even though she was a politician. And Every time when we go to ONU, to SEEDS, and many other international places to speak about Marielle, we also bring the struggle that the Black people, the Black women, the Black teens are having in Brazil. Since 2018, like I said in my introductions, we've been facing this whole fake news, and it's very, very hard because they are going straight to church and creating many fantasy about the other candidate. Right now, we are in a break for the second round for elections for president. In the end of this month, we're gonna be facing one of our hardest and most important elections in Brazil. So with that being said, what I'm trying to do, besides the Institute and besides the work that we've been doing and showing toward democracy, advertising people about fake news, we are very strong in Brazil in social media. So this has become one of our powerful tools here. But there is something, because every time we speak about democracy and Marielle and Black people outside Brazil, outside the country, and if this becomes, goes to the media or is televisionized or something like this, they start to paying attention more on us. So that's why I started my research and my PhD, because a lot of people here, they don't speak English at all. And this is a very hard barrier to go on and connect to people from outside of the country. And I started doing the research about how the language has become this tool for Black women in academia, but also for Black women who are activists and human rights defenders. Not only because of the translation, but also because sometimes we want to connect and to show our work, but they don't have the language. So this is what we are working and researching and studying now. So for next year, if Lula wins the election, who is the candidate that we are supporting, and and hoping things gets better, not only for the poor people, but specifically to the racial issues that we're going through right now. We are thinking about create something inside the Institute to a fellowship with Marielle's name, to bring and to help those women to even to get the language, but also to go back to university and study and know their own history. Because there is something here in Brazil, they don't like to speak about racial issues. We don't have, we have a lot of intellectual women, we have a lot of people who does, but it's kind of like we don't exist for government and for a lot of people. So it has been like a lot of work. It has been tough. Some of us has been threatened, and some of us cannot, speak in some place, in some regions in Brazil right now. But we've been trying to create this, not create the movement, like to empower the movement that we already have been having for many years. And hopefully things gonna get better after January 1st, if he gets elected. But if we continue and we still have our president, we're gonna have a lot of hard time, because we have 40% of the population who is still voting for him. And I'm speaking about this because democracy is being so fragile here. I'm talking about women who go outside of the country, outside of their house wearing red, and people say you should die. I'm talking about Black women who wear their beautiful clothes on and the hair the way we love to wear, and they say you should die because you were stinking, ugly Black person. These are the kind of people who vote for this president. We cannot write, we cannot speak, we cannot go on social media and say anything. I think Idrija knows Rosana Pinheiro, who is a professor. She said she would be watching, just like her and me, people who were like producing works to go against these democracies that they defend, we are in a little bit in danger because of all that and what these people are believing and how they legitimate hateness, racism, misogyny, and all that. So it's a lot of work. I mean, we know we're not gonna change the whole world, but since my sister has become this symbol, and since now we have voice for many people who doesn't have, we've been doing a lot of work to advertise and to say that Black people are here, Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ania. That it was so moving to hear about your story and your thoughts on democracy in Brazil. And finally, if I could ask AJ now to kind of circle back to the first question, that do you see any hope for renewal of democracy in Turkey and globally? And also to bring back the question of gender, what role might gender-based mobilizations play in the renewal of democracy? So over to AJ.
Before beginning to answer your question, I want to pick up from where Dudu left. No, I'm sorry, Aniela left. Fake news. And actually also Mina mentioned victimizations of the victims and the journalists who make news about those victims. And also Dudu mentioned something like all politicians are bad, corrupt, and so on. Let me combine all this to say that this is why I keep on saying that rise of fascism is global, because it plays out through the same pattern, exactly the same pattern everywhere. I can give examples, endless examples for all Mina, Aniela, and Dudu talked about earlier from Turkey. So one of the things that's very important to me for people to understand, both in the West and the East, North and South, that this is happening exactly the same way. So I know how maddening it is to go through these things, fake news, victimization of the victim, and so on, oppression of the victim. So one of the most exhausting part of the struggle against fascism is feeling alone. And, in Turkey, when it started in 2007, let's say, we felt so much alone. And it took us like 10 years or even more, even longer, to understand that, this is happening in other parts of the world. So, when Trump was elected in the United States, the Western communities, the Western audience, Western media thought that, oh, this is happening to them. Although many of us from India, from Turkey, from Hungary, from Italy, we felt like we were watching the same movie all over again, just on a bigger screen. So if we could only come together to realize that this is our shared problem, we're going through the exact same predicament, part of the job will be done, I think. And please let me say good luck to Aniela and Lula. Yes, this will be the hardest election in Brazil history. But something very recently, a few days ago, happened in Vienna, gave me some hope, so to speak. We were, after the Vienna Humanities Festival, we were having dinner. A person from the United States, a German, a British, an Australian, and me. While we were talking, we were constantly checking our phone because it was the election night in Brazil. And we were obviously all supporting Lula, and we were trying to see who's going, who's going to win the election. We were all depressed, of course, the following morning to see that it's for the second round now. This is not only to wish good luck to Aniela and all those beautiful people in Brazil, but also to say that on certain level, this resistance is already global. Everybody is watching out for that, the better candidate to win against fascism. Also, there is the fact that Amazon will be safer in Lula's hands, so that's We are basically trying to, we are, concerned about the lungs of the world as well. And here I want to connect to Dudu's input about all politicians are bad. I think we should be challenging this understanding. I think Mina touched upon it a little bit. Not all politicians are bad. And one of the reasons we ended up with these guys, from Modi to Erdogan, from Trump to Boris Johnson, whatever, Bolsonaro, is that because for decades people were told that politics is dirty and you don't even have to be interested in politics. It would be taken care of by some on administrative level, and it will be free market economy anyway who will decide what's going to happen. So I think we should challenge this discourse of politics is dirty. No, politics is not dirty. Progressive politics is not dirty. Not all politicians are corrupt. Just to give you a very, very small example, Selahattin Demirtas, who is a Kurdish politician and who was going to be the hope against Erdogan, is now in prison, has been in prison for years now for no reason. I'm sure there are politicians in Brazil, in India, in other places where there are such leaders, are in prison and they are not corrupt at all. So I think we should be quite careful when we talk about politics and generalizing politics in that sense. That kind of diminishes our chance to call people into politics to demand their rights. As for hope, I actually don't like the word hope because hope has become some sort of a commodity in today's world. And I keep on seeing on every level of global debate about democracy this word hope. And it's mostly pronounced by liberal Democrats who do not want to question the core reason of this democratic crisis. And they want to give hope to people as if to sustain the current situation. And also, I think hope is too fragile a word for our harsh times. And there is one another thing. Hope is maybe a little bit inconsequential even, because I don't know what it changes for all of us here. If I say that there is hope, what would you do differently tomorrow? Or if I make you believe that there is no hope, would you do anything differently tomorrow? No. So I think hope, the word hope is a little bit tricky. It is a little bit deceitful, and it takes the discussion to somewhere where we are not almost allowed to speak about the crises in a genuine manner. Instead, I prefer the word faith in humankind, because what happened in the last decades is the loss of faith in democracy and loss of faith in humankind in general. Neoliberalism imposed on us the idea that human beings are selfish, self-centered, ugly creatures. I think we have to start from there to challenge that very dominant, fundamental understanding of human being to go to save democracy. Because faith in democracy is rightfully maybe has been shaken by the social inequality. How can you make people believe that they are equals when they every day see that they are not equal? How can you expect people to exercise democracy, practice democracy every 4 years, only, one time every 4 years, when they are not experiencing democracy in their workplace, in their own lives? the main problem about democracy today is that it has become a theatrics of itself. And you cannot make people excited about it. Therefore, you cannot actually resist against fascism unless you promise them to democratize everything, especially economy. If you don't promise them to democratize economy, I mean, like the most fancy promise of democracy wouldn't hold, wouldn't mean anything to people. So I think democratizing economy and democratizing life in general should be the promise of those people who are trying to give hope. But still, I want to repeat this, faith in each other, faith in ourselves, that is the thing that is damaged. It is not hope that is not existent at this point. It is the faith. Because, you know, there are those times that there is no hope. But faith is something irrefutable. If you believe in something, that's it. You do whatever you need to do, even though there is no hope. So that is why I think we have to replace the idea of hope with the idea of faith in people. Most of us who are in this struggle, let's say, are quite exhausted because we are very few, we know that. And there's so much to be done. And 21st century is too complicated, too much, and every time it feels like too late to do something. And only if we can renew our faith, and only if we can make a moral choice to believe in people, I think we can go on giving the struggle, fighting the good fight. In Iran, for instance, I think until like a few weeks ago, there was no hope for women. But then very few women in the beginning just believed in people. They believed that if these very few people go on streets, the others would follow. That is believing in people. So they did what they had to do. And every person, every woman that goes on street, take her headscarf right now, believes that the others who are watching will be part of this resistance. So what changed everything in Iran since a few weeks was not hope. It was believing in people. I think we should learn from that experience. This is all I had to say.
Thank you, Ege. It was really interesting to hear the way in which you spelled out the difference between faith and hope. And also, I found your reflections on the experiential and the kind of seeing and experiencing democracy every day, I think can be a useful way also for us to think about where might possibilities for renewal of democracy lie. So it's not just something that's a matter of deliberation and kind of high politics of citizenship. So yeah,
If I
I'm
may
sure.
add one sentence.
Yes, please.
Sorry to say this, it feels a little bit embarrassing, but this is why I wrote together a manifesto against a hopeless world, and that is the first chapter of the book, Faith Against Hope. Mm-hmm. So if anyone is interested in that thought, I would suggest, I'm like, if they like to, they can have a look at the book. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm sure that will give us a lot to think about creatively in relation to what the future of democracy might be. So as we wrap up this in the final round, I kind of invite all the panelists maybe to share their final thoughts on what kind of creative work might there be, what kind of future directions artistic work and kind of work in the literary and poetic and artistic field might take, and how it might speak to the future of democracy. So if I could start with Meena, like would you have any final thoughts or reflections on what future directions you might like to see for a work on literature and social issues and democracy? Yes, over to Meena. Meena, are you there with us?
Sorry, I think listening to Eshe made me feel like completely dazzled, I'm I was like a student taking notes and did not think of what I'm going to say. But all I would like to touch upon, it's also very difficult for me. In the beginning, it was because in Tamil, we don't have, I think the word for hope, faith, confidence, trust, and also belief are the same word. It's a very old language, so we have a very difficult problem. So I was actually thinking, what do you do when all of these words are mixed up, which also
What
leads
is
to
the
very,
word?
it says nambikai.
No.
Yeah, so if a boyfriend says, do you have nambikai on me, or he says keep your nambikai on me, it means trust me. But if I say எனக்கு நாளை நம்பிக்கை இருக்கு, that means I have hope in tomorrow. Or like, so it's a word that you can use for all of this: trust, belief, confidence, hope, faith. So it's this little word, and I really think that so I kept thinking about that. But coming to the other question of the future of how literature, as well as the project of democracy, is that one of those things we have to do is also we have to realize, as much as all of us are here as speakers, is that we're all here despite a lot of gatekeeping. And so literature itself is not democratic. So, it's one thing to go and democratize society, but it's one thing to understand that we are operating ourselves under a very dysfunctional system. So there's gatekeeping of voices, there's gatekeeping of news outlets, there's gatekeeping of opinion. And also media for a long time has been just generating the opinion, like at this stuff that Chomsky said, but also even otherwise. And in some ways, just for the sake of grabbing headlines and other things, again, coming back to fake news that Anil was talking about. So all of these are operating in a grid. But one thing that I feel is that as writers, we need to, this is a question that involves both writers and women, and I'm going to take just a minute, is that often, and again, it's nothing that the previous speaker hasn't said, but I just wanted to reflect on it, is that what is really crucial is a very dialectical thing, isn't it? Like, when quantity changes, the quality changes. So it's a question of how many of us are there, how many of us as women are there, that you change the way things are approached, but also in terms of writing, how many writers take the stand? Because at the moment, there's a complete capture of not just literature, but of the the intellectual system that's happening in India. So most 97% of media outlets, at least the television media, is owned by one man. And now the second richest guy is trying to own whatever other independent media is left. So media ownership is in the wrong hands. And whichever media tries to operate independently, and often these independent media operate online, they face threats of defamation or litigation. And the third thing is, and this is the funniest thing, is that the right wing has started to mimic the left wing. So earlier they used to laugh at you for festivals, right? The right wing approach is that, oh, that's where all the lefties go, all the liberals go, and they drink and whatever. But then now like literally in every city, the right wing runs its own festivals. And it becomes de facto the only festival of those cities, because that's where the elite lean. So it also becomes a question of where do you find space, but also what do generations of writers do? How do you meet people? Because the publishing industry is in doldrums. Like so it's I think a very complex question, and I think something that writers not only have to comment on the state and mechanisms of power and fascism, but also look back and see how systems of control are operating. For instance, recently Penguin said that they wouldn't publish Varavar Rav's poetry because it contained the word revolution. Now, what's very interesting about Penguin here is that I'm a co-editor of his poetry. Varavar Rav is one of the 16 people arrested in the Bhima Koregaon case. Is that I never went to Penguin. Penguin came to me and said, we want to publish his book. They suggested a title, Revolutionary Poet Varavar Rao. Right? But apparently the team that deals with the ideas is not the same team as the legal team, which looks through the context of the poems. And then they said, we can't use the word revolution, we can't use the word Hindutva, we can't use the word saffron, we can't even use the word dictator. And we are like, but this poem is from, the time of the emergency. This is written in 76, 77. It was another dictator, but you're like, no, 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 no. Other dictators will see themselves and think it's about them, and there will be actions. So, and this is where we have come to. And I also wanted to say, like, Arundhati Roy, when I went to her and spoke about this, she said to me, every single word that Penguin has black marked and said cannot be used. I have used it in my books. So that's also how the market operates, right? So Arundhati can get there, Meena can get there. A few of us manage to breach. We can use all of these very powerful words and not face consequences, but others face censorship. So yeah, I think as writers, we have to both look outside and call out whatever is happening, but also look inside and try to at least talk about what's happening to our own systems,
Thank you, Meena, for those thoughts. And if I could now ask Dudu to comment on kind of what your thoughts might be on emerging and future directions for this kind of creative work that engages democracy. So, yeah, Dudu.
I think my response will mirror what Meena was saying. So I will quote Minolo and Tola's I can't pronounce the other name, but they say that knowledge remains territorial and imperial as scholars produce knowledge that is always shaped and formed in a context of power. And for me as a researcher, as a Black woman navigating the university space, I have found that, I have had to navigate power, which I have found to be elusive. But beyond that, how we engage broadly with the people that we work with, the participants in our research, the people that are interviewed and quoted. Again, power operates in those spaces where my voice becomes the default that is authoritative. But again, Bhattacharya says the fundamental idea that as researchers we are authorized to obtain information from participants for the sole purpose of advancing our research agendas is inherently arrogant, intrusive, and objectifying. Participants are not data repositories from whom we are free to extract information. Perhaps instead they're agents of wisdom through and with whom we learn based on what they are willing to offer. So thinking about future directions in research, I think it's thinking about those partnerships and how those partnerships with communities and people that we work with are structured and how power operates and how we ourselves reflect on our own power, but also reflect on the institutions that we are part of and we represent and what that means in the work that we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Dudu. And if I could now ask Aniela to kind of comment on emerging and future directions of her work and how that might speak to the questions of democracy. Yes. Aniela, are you with us? Actually, Aniela had messaged me saying that there was some power disruption at her end, so maybe she might have lost connection. I'll just check with her to she. Yeah, I think there is a connectivity problem at her end, so I just hope she can rejoin us. And she says no internet on laptop, and yeah. So while we wait for Aniela maybe to rejoin us, maybe we can have Eje reflect on kind of her thoughts about what future directions she would like to see as far as literary engagements with social issues and democracy are concerned. Yes, over to you, Eje.
Well, I mean, like the world will have to learn from women, and one of the things that they have to learn has been managed by female literature. We use the term in feminist literature reversing the gaze a lot. We meant that, you know, okay, male has been looking to women, but now we're looking back. We are reversing the gaze. I think this term can apply to politics today as well on global level. I think we have to reverse the political gaze as well. All this time throughout colonialism, especially, but still in our times, there's this Western gaze towards countries like ours. But now we have to reverse that gaze and tell them their story. Because actually we know their story better than them to start with. And they have to look at us to learn what will happen to them in terms of political crisis. That is why I think India, you know, African countries, Brazil, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, Italy, they should all tell the Western European countries and United States what is happening to them and what will happen to them. They will have to learn from us, and only if they learn and accept the fact that this is the same problem everywhere, then we can combine the stamina of the West and the experience of the East and South to make this resistance global. Western countries still have the stamina, but in our countries, for the last 20 years at least, we have been exhausted by limitless oppression. They still, you know, are not as exhausted, as paralyzed, as, you know, beaten up as we are. So we need their stamina. But then they need our experience, because when Trump came to power, when Boris Johnson came to power, they were so shocked that they couldn't analyze what's happening to them. And when they began to analyze, they turned in on themselves, and they didn't look at the world, the rest of the world, and they didn't see that rest of the world has been going through this all the time, like for decades. Sometimes, you know, when my better self is not there, I want to repeat Malcolm X's words to Western audiences, which was something like, the roosters came home to nest, I think, if I'm not remembering it wrong. He said this when Kennedy was assassinated. And what he meant was CIA doing political assassinations all over the world. And now it came back to our home and it killed Kennedy. So all these regimes in India, everywhere, in Turkey, they are the remnants of 1980s, 1960s even, the Cold War, all these, you know, generations of progressives, leftists, tortured, killed, you know, exiled, imprisoned. Every generation was a harvest of progressives, a cruel harvest of progressives. And at the end, of course, we ended up fewer and more exhausted. I think there will come a time that the West will look into itself, you know, to itself, and come to some sort of redemption. It's not the time right now. This is the time for global resistance. But I wish we will see that. I am hoping that we will see that time of redemption as well. Thank you so very much for letting me talk.
Thank you, Ajay. Those were very, very useful concluding thoughts. It seems like we are not in touch with Aniela anymore because of her internet disruptions. So I think there are a couple of, so we might now want to open up the floor for questions, and we have some questions in the chat box already. So I think these are more general questions. So maybe I'll quickly summarize the question, and whoever wants to take, whichever panelists want to take the question, maybe they can respond to it. So there is a question from Tony Caravan about how neoliberalism and capitalism is, according to them, not being questioned, is certainly not in the UK and the English-speaking world. I mean, the relationship between two, and there are many grassroots organizations that see the structural issues arising, especially from extractive and oppressive doctrines. For example, Helena Norberg Hodge challenges this very strongly through localfutures.org. So I think this is more of both a comment and a question. And there's another question from Lindsay, which talks about how, again, the relationship between neoliberal capitalism and the issue of exacerbation, democratic destruction, and so on. I wonder if the question is if there is more research in non-university arena on this issue of the relationship between neoliberal capitalism and democratic destruction than in universities, for example. And they quote Paul Mason's book on how to stop fascism is an example of a book in this area, and so on. So, and how does one, are there ways in which we can kind of further get research funding on to address this issue? And yeah, so those were, and yeah, I think those are the two questions that are there. And I think Ankita wanted to, did you have a question as well? I think Ankita wanted to ask the question. Did you want to ask the question?
Yeah, I can add the,
Please.
I can just sort of say it out loud, and whoever wants to respond to it. I was just curious about, since we were talking about the pattern that authoritarianism seems to follow across the world, I was just curious about if the panelists feel that in their particular contexts, the right wing does present itself as a benevolent force, as a force that sort of watches out for those who are being sidelined, whose interests are being sidelined by the immigrants or by minorities. I mean, I had in mind, the BJP investing in service delivery in India, or various examples in the UK about setting up whites only food banks, providing white British people some kind of priority in council housing and things of that sort. So do they observe in their own contexts that the right or the authoritarian sort of forces present themselves as a benevolent force?
Yeah. So if you want to take that question, please, the three questions.
I'll take the question that is by Tony Caravan here. Very quickly, when I said that, neoliberalism is not, questioned enough, I of course meant the mainstream media, mainstream opinion circles. Of course, there are many people who are writing, talking about the issue. But very quick example, I was in Athens Democracy Forum organized by New York Times. I was in the opening panel. And I said that, if you're serious about saving democracy, you should seriously think about redistribution of wealth. And today, New York Times made a supplement, 8 pages of supplement. There were 2 pieces about what I have talked about there, but redistribution of wealth was not included in those quotations. So, yeah, this is what I meant. The mainstream opinion circles is not very warmed up to the idea yet. That's all I had to say.
Yeah, and the other questions, anyone wants to take Ankita's question and the other question about the relationship between capitalism and democracy, if it's been, there's been research outside the academia as well on this topic. I think that was the other question. And
yeah, I would like to comment on it. I don't want to be the only one answering them. I'm sure others have far more insightful answers. So this idea of research, this idea of, using jargon, that's something also we need to break. Because the thing is that the people who are actually doing like research is something that filters much later on, like, it filters on because people see things in the ground. So for instance, calling out, like, and these two questions are linked as well. The question you spoke about, capitalism and fascism. Like in India, we know the two richest men are upholding this regime. We know that under electoral bonds, a lot of money has gone into sustaining the RSS BJP in such a manner that the next largest party is has like 5 times less funds. That's not how it's supposed to function, right? Most of, like 90% of the electoral bonds, which are like undeclared money, which is donations, are going to one single party. So when this is so the question is like, what are and the people, and are academics the first ones to call this out, or is it being called out on the ground by, let's say, leftists and workers? Is it being called around by the people of like in India's indigenous people who are saying, don't take away our forests and give it to your corporate friends and allow this mining to take place? Is it not called out by people who are fisher people whose livelihood is going away because Adani has decided to buy up all the ports around India? So I think that the real research in that sense is not about publication of papers. It's not, for me, the research is like what people are doing, what they are battling. Like later on, all of these filters, so is there any non-university research? Then the question is that, is non-university research sustainable? Because every single thought in the world is locked behind some stupid paywall, or you need a friend with any access to go and read it. So how can you even sustain any non-university research? So you can also be very cynical, because that's what's happening to let's say very pristine, very jargon-full knowledge. So you also have to look at these kinds of knowledge that exist among people, exist among resistance movements, exist among militant people, and the language that they use, this language in which they both call out fascism and capitalism, and the nexus between them. So one of the things they say, is that there are two people selling this country and two people buying this country. So the two people selling, and so you face this all the time. And I remember actually I went to this really small village called Silgare in Bastar, which is like a zone of conflict between the Maoist and the people and the Indian military forces and the people. There's a small village that doesn't have electricity, that doesn't have drinking water, doesn't have toilets, but there are like army camps. And the army camps are there because they want to put roads, and they want to put roads because they want to do resource extraction, and they want to pave the way for the movement of troops. And the kind of slogans that you hear there, like, the first question, one of the slogan was Desh Drohi Kaun Hai, Modi, Amit Shah. So the question is, people are not even saying it. They're not even calling them fascists. They're saying, who are the traitors of this country? And then they are naming the fascists. So, you learn so much on the ground. And that's where I would say that, real research or real action takes place. Now, coming to this other question in terms of authoritarian regimes pretending to be benevolent, this is actually an issue that's going on now one of the things that Modi's government does is every single welfare scheme, including welfare schemes that are funded like locally by states, where the centers or the union government's contribution is less than 10% or only for the first year. It's trying to brand it as a Pradhan Mantri something something scheme, meaning a prime minister scheme, but it's actually the local states funding it. And even the money that comes from the center is the money that goes from the state to the center as taxation and then comes back. So, the kind of major branding exercises, and they're doing this for, the construction of homes. They're doing this for the construction of toilets. They're doing this for giving you pension. So they're doing this to you for your insurance policy, naming everything after the prime minister. So there is, so it's both benevolence and a branding exercise, so just want to stop there.
Thank you. And the others, do you want to take that? If I could quickly read out, there's one more question here, which is quite an interesting question about whether, from Patrick Thelwell, that do you agree that anthropocentrism has produced certain hierarchies that actually shape the rise of fascism, and if humanity might be able to transcend this dualistic relationship with nature to create multi-species cosmocracies? I think that's a really interesting question in relation to also capitalism. And I think in the first panel, we spoke a lot more about this in terms of environmental activism, but I was wondering if any of you had any thoughts on that, whether the problem is with this kind of thinking about human beings at the center of the universe, and the kind of anthropocentrism it produces, and how does that enable fascism or not? And that's any of the speakers wanted to respond to that.
Very briefly,
Yes.
I can say.
Ajay.
Very briefly, I can say that I remember Adorno writing something like Holocaust began at the what do you call them, where they kill the animals, slaughterhouses. And Holocaust began when we were crossing by the slaughterhouse and saying that, oh, they're animals. So cosmocracy, this cosmos understanding and applying democracy to it has been there quite a long time, but we still have a lot of way to go. And I think we have a lot to learn from the old knowledge in India and in my part of the world, where there is this oneness with nature, and there is no hierarchy between the living beings. But then we still have a long way to go there, I think.
Okay, so I think we're almost nearing the end of the panel, and if I could, there's one final question that we can take probably from Richard, who talks about I completely get the numerous shortcomings and emerging risks of democracy. Does the panel believe that the Russian, Chinese, North Korean, Syrian, or Iranian models are any better? Whoa, that's a long shot, but if anyone wants to quickly respond to that. Any quick responses or concluding thoughts on that question?
Well, obviously no, so I'll stop it there.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. I don't think that all of these regimes you mentioned are authoritarian regimes, and also then you also go back to this grand debate about whether you can have socialism in one country. So I'm not going to go there, but obviously that's not. See, we are talking about reimagining democracy and deciding all of this, which means that whatever end of capitalism that we foresee is going to make sure that whatever world we create doesn't lead to this. We have learned our lessons from history. So learning lessons from history doesn't only mean learning lessons from the history of fascism and neoliberalism, or whatever it is, the Cold War. It also means learning lessons from the failure of supposedly socialist states, the failure that's happened. So I definitely think that we have to address that as well. And that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Meena. I think with that, we are kind of towards the end of this colloquium, and it has been really, really exciting and enriching to have these wonderful contributions. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers, Meena and Aniel, who's unfortunately not here, Dudu and Ajay, and thank you for all of your rich contributions and the thoughts that you have shared on renewing democracy. And thank you also to my fellow organizers, and especially to Melissa for putting all of this together and kind of coordinating different time zones and all of that. It's great that it came together so well, and hope to see a lot of the audience also at the next colloquium, which I believe is on the 20th of October, and the recording for this colloquium will also be available on the YouTube channel of, and it will be shared on Twitter if you follow the Reinventing Citizenship Twitter handle. So thank you all, and have a lovely rest of the day and rest of whatever is left of your night, wherever you might be. So thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your participation, and thank you to the audience as well.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend. Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.